Hey AP, Tennyson here. It's good to see you for the first pre-recorded lesson of hybrid learning. In these two lessons for this week, we're going to focus on getting ready for the create task. You've already been assigned most of what I want you to take a look at before next week, but I do want to cover with you in these lessons some really critical points that will help you be successful on the create task. In addition to that, we'll look at how we can take some code maybe that we've been working on and turn that into something that fits the create task needs. And I'm going to do that because one important thing that I want you to remember, and I want to start this little set of recorded lessons off with, is that if you approach the create task from the perspective of, okay, I'm going to try to meet these requirements and basically force myself to meet the requirements, you probably, one, will not have fun, and two, those requirements won't necessarily fit with the flow of the program, which is actually really important for getting a good score. And so what I would encourage you to do is, however you're most comfortable starting a new project, start that way. For me, I know I tell you guys a lot of times, like, we're going to organize our code by functions, and sometimes I do that, but there's other times when I'm like, all right, I feel really inspired about this idea. I'm just going to sit down and start to write some code that will make it work. And then guess what? I go back and I organize it. I use functions. I put things in classes if necessary. I use more advanced data structures that are appropriate for what I'm trying to do. So for some of you, it might be better to actually start your program organically in that way. And you'll be more likely to end up going to meet the requirements in the end when you have to fix up your code so it looks good. Okay? And I'm going to try to show you an example of how we might do that with something that's sort of been written from scratch. So with that in mind, please watch both of these lessons all the way through, and I look forward to seeing you on our virtual meeting hopefully soon. All right, guys, so the first place we need to know about as far as the create task is concerned is on code.org. There is a unit that you have been assigned, and I'm not going to keep you assigned to this unit for very long, so please take note of where it's at. You should be able to see it regardless. If you have any issues, you can just let me know. But what I really want you all to focus on in Unit 8 is this Lesson 1 lesson overview. And if I go into this little module here, I have access to basically all of the critical stuff that we need to know in order to be successful for the create task. You'll see that there are the instructions, and this is the instructions for basically how you go about doing the create task and what it must have. And in addition, and I'll zoom in just a little so you can see easier, we've got these scoring guidelines. Now, I know that you all have probably seen some documents like this before, and you've kind of just opened them up and been like, what on earth? Oh my God, I don't want to deal with this. In the case of the create task, if you don't deal with this, you probably will not be very successful. So we are going to actually spend some time going over this together, and I know that it's painful, but I really need you, if you want to be successful on the AP create task, to go over this in detail. And we're going to talk about strategies for reading it without sort of getting lost in all the technical language. We'll talk about that a little bit in these recorded lessons today, okay? But I just want to really emphasize to you the importance, and it's not that long, it's only 5 pages, okay? It's not too complicated, and in fact, there's some extra bonus helpful definitions down here, but really it's not a ton. But I know that sometimes this academic stuff that your teachers give you can be a little intimidating to look over and try to understand, but it is critical that we do it. Okay. We're going to actually start in this video with the task instructions. What's cool is if you want to keep track of this and kind of share it across multiple places, I've actually also put this in Google Classroom where you can download it, but you can download it as well. It's just a PDF, so feel free to do so. Let's focus on what's critical about this document. So we've got our performance task instructions here. Again, I do want you to read this. I want you to read every single line of this on your own, but I'm going to highlight some really critical points that we've been discussing in person. So the first is it talks about in the create performance task, you will design and implement a program that might solve a problem, enable innovation, explore personal interests, or express creativity. Now that's AP's long-winded and eloquent way of saying that you can ultimately do whatever you want to do with the create task. It is your project. It has to meet the requirements if you want to score well, but you should choose to do something that you will be motivated to complete and inspired by as you work on it. That might mean that you think about a real-world problem that could be needing to be solved, like something you want to actually solve. You could explore a personal interest, so if that's music, games, sports, etc., you're going to be able to do stuff around that. And you can express your creativity. And that's, anytime we're coding, we're expressing our creativity. One thing I'll mention is that you cannot use any prior projects from our class. Now, with that being said, if you found a particular type of project interesting, you can use that as inspiration for the create task code. However, you cannot simply take code from, for example, the tic-tac-toe game or the Caesar cipher and simply copy and paste it and talk about it in the written responses. You cannot do that. I have seen students do that before, and this is a good time to talk about what plagiarism ultimately is in the create task, okay? Once you have started the create task on your own, and we'll set a date where we say, okay, everyone is officially starting the create task today. Okay, we're going to basically do that. And, well, hold on, let me pause. Sorry. We are going to say, at some point, start coding. You can be thinking about this all the time. But I'm going to give you a day where we say, all right, we're starting to code. And once we say that, I cannot help you with anything on your create task. That's why we spend a lot of time going over these instructions and over the rubric. Once you're done, what's going to happen is you will submit all of your stuff, including your code, your video, etc., which we're going to talk about. You're going to submit all that into the AP website. And the only interaction I will have with your code is to mark it as plagiarized or not plagiarized. So, I am obligated, if you use some old code, if you go out to Google and you copy and paste something down for like your whole program. I'm not saying you can't copy and paste code snippets. That'll be fine. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but that's okay. But if you take like an entire set of code or your algorithm that you choose to talk about in your written responses, if that comes from someone else and I find that out, I'm just going to mark it as plagiarism, and you will not get a score. That's what will happen. So that's really my only interaction with like grading your create task. Now, we might have a separate grade in class for turning it in, for like participating in the process, but that will have nothing to do with an actual evaluation of your create task, just to be clear. Okay. So, you are actually allowed to collaborate if you choose on the development of the program. So the code that you write, you can do it in collaboration with someone else, and we'll get into some details about how that works. But the written responses and the video that you submit must be completed by you. Okay. Let's move on to talking about like what is actually required. Now, we are going to be working on this outside of, quote unquote, outside of class. And what I mean by that is that all the asynchronous time that is built into our hybrid schedule will be devoted to the create task. I will not be assigning you any homework, or if I find it that it's critical, I might assign a little homework, but from this point forward, I won't really be assigning homework for the AP-CSP stuff. You all will just be responsible for understanding what we're talking about in lecture or in the pre-recorded lessons, but I'm not really going to assign a bunch of assignments for you. We will still have the assessments, that's going to happen, but I won't give you like some kind of big homework to complete because for the most part you're going to be working on the create task. So anytime we're working on the create task, I will not be assigning you homework, and that asynchronous time will be devoted to the create task. And you're going to get at least 12 hours of it. And and that means basically 12 days. So this will be coming soon. Okay. You're responsible for all of your code, submitting it, a video that displays your program running and demonstrates what you did. It should show every functionality of your program basically, and the written responses to the prompts, and we'll talk about what those are soon. Okay. Now, your code has to have a few things. It's going to all be submitted all in one PDF file to AP, and we'll actually use a tool called CodePrint to do that. It's very easy. If you're concerned about how do I make my code a PDF without it looking busted, I'll show you how to do that too. So let's look at the key components of what your create task must include. It's got to include some kind of input from the user or from a device of some kind. This can be like touch. If you're doing like a simulated phone app, we'll look at some examples of how we can do that later on. It could be an online data stream. You guys might remember using tools like requests and Beautiful Soup, or me talking about APIs on the internet. That's an example of an online data stream, and you can use that as your input. You can also use files that you build and bring into Python or whatever programming language you choose for this project. You can use that as input. This is new for this year. You have to use at least one list or another collection type. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next video, but you guys know what lists are, so that's pretty straightforward. You've got to use at least one, and it's got to make sense. Okay. All right. It says you have to have at least one procedure that contributes to the program's intended purpose. What it means by procedure, anytime you see this, guys, in the AP CSP context, a procedure is a function. Okay, so anytime you see that word procedure, which will in fact be on the exam a lot, because even when they write the procedures in the AP coding language, that's what they use. They use all caps procedure and then like the name of the function. So if you see procedure, it is a function. Your algorithm or a algorithm in your program has to use sequence, right? Code does this, then it does that. It has to use selection, that's if and else, and it has to use iteration, some kind of a loop. All right. So that's a good algorithm, right? Or I guess not a good algorithm. That's a silly word to use. That's a robust algorithm. It does lots of things. So something to keep in mind. And then you have to at least call the function that you wrote. That seems pretty obvious. And it has to provide some kind of output. Okay. So it can be tactile, meaning you feel it. It can be audible, meaning you hear it. It can be something we see, or it can be text like in a console application, which is what we're very used to building. Okay. We're not going to go over the video too in depth right now. That'll come later on, but I will say you should note these things. One is that at no point in your video or anything else in your code should you include any information about yourself. You should not include your name in your code. You should not include your name in the video or talk about what school you're from, any of that kind of stuff. All of that should be anonymous. Now, I guess you could talk about Fern Creek, but you shouldn't, talk about. Well, actually, I'm gonna have to look that up. I've never had a student do something that's specifically related to Fern Creek, so now I'm kind of curious. But overall, we want to be as anonymous as possible. This is to avoid a reader of your code being biased against you based on who you are. Okay. Your video must also be in one of these formats. It can't be more than a minute long, and it can't be more than 30 megs. And we will talk about how to achieve that when we get closer to the video. Okay, so I'm actually going to pause here. Those are the critical highlights from the create task instructions. And in the next video, we're going to look at the rubric, and we're going to look at a couple of specific things on the written responses.